Hello, I am your host, Chris Crossroads, and welcome to Fantasia Way, where we discuss the why behind the way we weave stories. Hello, travelers. Welcome to Fantasia Way. In this episode, we will be talking about how we decide to make characters act. All stories have characters. In fact, they are probably the most necessary component for storytelling. Even poetry is told through the eyes of the poet, after all. Thus, deciding how to direct our characters to behave in a story is vital to the process of telling a story. This episode, we will delve into understanding what it means to create a character with, as well as the reason behind creating characters with, a clear purpose. Let's start with why we write characters. Characters are, at their core, not people. Many storytellers devote themselves to make their characters realistic. The naturalist and realist movements of the early 20th century certainly contributed to that goal. Much of the years following and prior to World War II had a large focus on creating realistic situations and reflecting how real people interact in them. This led to deep and emotionally compelling characters in stories that brought people into the situations that were described. However, like many things, especially things relating to creativity and subjective experiences, there needs to be a balance. Too much focus on realistic characters can create a blockage in creativity due to wanting to ensure that your characters reflect as closely to real-life people as possible. Meanwhile, it may harm your audience's experience whenever you focus so strongly on making characters realistic and then walk your audience into an unrealistic situation. There's an important piece of advice that was given by the professional writing consultant Local on his YouTube channel, where he discusses different topics about writing. He is often quoted saying, "Characters aren't people," and many creatives complained about such a phrase. However, he explained in his episode on writing character motivation that, quote, "All it means is that humans are endlessly complex and paradoxical critters, and the literal pile of words as your character will never quite encompass the lived experience of a real human being." He goes on to point out that it's not only okay that written characters fail to be completely realistic, but honestly makes the story more enjoyable, since, as he says, any human being is going to be deeply uninteresting 99% of the time. Storytellers often worry about getting people invested in their stories, and especially in their characters. However, this shouldn't come from the decision to make characters, quote, realistic. Instead, to accept the title given to them, characters, and use it to its fullest. Center the story around the characters as they are, instead of attempting to expand them out into a complexity that is unnecessary. A character in a short story doesn't need to have a tragic backstory. Instead, make the story about the character as they are in that moment. The other benefit of removing the burden of creating realistic characters is the freedom to make characters unreal and, in fact, more purposeful. Sometimes it's important to realize that, while characters are vital to a story, and the audience should be invested in the character, the goal of a story is to tell a story. It is important to accept that sometimes a character's purpose is for the sake of the story, rather than for their own sake. But that advice is also a difficult thing to balance. So, how do we make characters with purpose? Knowing we as storytellers aren't required to make our characters realistic means that we are free to use them to tell a compelling story. However, that also makes us responsible for knowing how to use characters to tell a compelling story. Sometimes that comes from fleshing out the characters to be more relatable or more complex. Remember, balance is key. However, it can also come from not making a character complex. The attempts in the past few decades to make antagonists relatable and complex have been a boon to storytelling. However, there is a slow reawakening of the desire for the simpler antagonists who are just evil or malicious, not out of some form of relatable trauma or complex motivation, but because they are themselves greedy or mean for the sake of it. This can be confusing when a storyteller thinks that they need to have their villain be complex and realistic. But it's important to make a distinction. A character is there to tell the story and be the perspective for the audience. If a character does not serve the purpose of the story, then they have become more of a curio to the process of the story's creation than a piece of the larger framework. An example of an author who wrote stories with a distinct purpose was Ernest Hemingway. He wrote his stories without added fluff, nor did he create anything in his writing that would distract from the goal of his pieces. Much of his writing was simple and straightforward, rarely beautiful, but always clear. This was due to his awareness of how to write with brevity and clarity. Many authors advise removing fluff in writing, and it's the same with how storytellers should treat their characters. A character who serves no purpose to the story other than comic relief, while amusing, isn't always good for the story. We've often heard Stephen King's quote on killing your darlings, but I think George Orwell puts it just as well, saying, "If it is possible to cut a word out, always cut it out." The same may be just as valuable for looking at characters. After all, think of writing a mystery. Every character you introduced is going to be viewed as a potential suspect. So, when you write a mystery, you try and keep the cast as small as possible so as not to make a bunch of unimportant characters suspects. This is the most natural example that occurs when it comes to creating characters with purpose. Making that intentional choice to remove purposeless characters may not only improve the enjoyment of the story, but the ability of an audience to understand the deeper purpose behind the whole story. The important thing is, when you decide how characters behave, you need to know why you are creating the characters to begin with. In conclusion, all characters are to a story as paint is to a painter or an instrument to a musician. They are tools to create art, not merely the art itself. Just as a good luthier, a person who makes and repairs instruments, must understand how the instrument is supposed to sound, so too does a writer need to know what a character is supposed to do in the grand orchestra of their story. If this is found to be lacking, then the story may lose pacing, emotion, or be irritating, like the sound of an 8-year-old on the recorder. Thank you for traveling with me on this episode of Fantasia Way. I hope you got as much enjoyment out of it as I did, and I'd love for you to come back this way whenever you have any desire to understand more about storytelling and the different ways we as storytellers can use our imagination. Would you kindly like, comment, and subscribe so you can keep up with our travels through this world of imagination, and I would love to see you again soon. You can find Fantasia Way on YouTube, and you can find me at Blue Sky at Chris Crossroads FW, or on Tumblr under the same name, Chris Crossroads FW. Thank you for listening.